So it's a pleasure to introduce John to you. As Darren said, it's to me occasionally improbable that I work on the history of apples in Maine, being trained in the history of Guatemala, particularly the colonial period. And I got to know John several years ago. He came to speak in Lemoyne about some work that he had done searching for an apple that's known as the Marlborough apple, one of the few apples that we know of as a native of Hancock County. And it slowly dawned on me after hearing him speak and several other sort of inspirations that it was a perfect sort of opportunity to get students working in the local community, particularly because some of the trees in this area could be as old as 200 years old. So the idea of being able to map local trees, send students out to do oral histories, identify some of the varieties was sort of a real natural extension of what I was doing elsewhere, training students in doing community-based research in Guatemala and Mexico as well. And I didn't really expect it to become an obsession. But it has. I've become very interested in the stories of local farming, particularly of the orchards, of the lost varieties. And I remember John sort of offhandedly in his first talk said that Maine probably had somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 named varieties of apples in 1850. And I think that single fact that we've lost that diversity is one of the sort of most, from my perspective, most compelling aspects of this, because you sort of think to yourself with each old tree that you find, this may be the one tree that exists of this. And I think John has this way of quietly inspiring people to go out and search. So it's been very fun for me over the last couple of years because we've had the opportunity to collaborate in a variety of ways. Probably the most exciting was we were able to take a group of students to England for about 17 days to look at the history of British agriculture, looking at orchards and cider production there, which was really fun because basically I got to drive the van and John taught the students everything they needed to know. And that was very fun because I got to learn as well. And we're now also collaborating on a project at MOFGA, which is John collaborated with former late director of MOFGA, Russell Libby, to launch a new Maine heritage orchard with 600 varieties. So this year we planted the first 100 varieties. And when we talked about what John should talk about today, there were, I think, 6.5 hours that we came up with. And we said, well, people's attention span is long, but maybe not that long. So I asked John to talk a little bit about his history of exploring for apples over the last 30 or 40 years. Then a little bit about the work that he's been doing to conserve those varieties at MOFGA, and then some of the other dimensions, particularly of working with COA students, because he's had a number of students who've interned with him and worked with him on a variety of different projects. So I thought I'd just turn it over to John.
Thank you, Todd. So I'm talking out the door here. If I look forward, so I'm going to sort of look around and try to see everybody at some point. I did go to Colby. I think that was before COA existed, so I couldn't come here. And I actually went to Colby not because I thought it was going to be any good, but because I wanted to be in Maine. And as a young boy, I came to Maine on a vacation and took one look at age 11 and said, okay, this is the place. And so for the rest of my childhood, I devoted myself to getting to Maine every chance I could. And then I heard that there was this college near where I wanted to be, which was called Colby, so I applied and fortunately got in. And the day after I graduated, I moved onto the property where I live now, which is in Palermo. So that was 42 years ago. And Palermo is halfway between Augusta and Belfast, and probably some of you have driven through it as you go to Boston. Toby's General Store is sort of in Palermo. And I thought I should say something about Martha Stewart living. I wasn't going to. But I can't remember how they found out about us, but they did. And so they sent a photographer out who spent 3 days with us on our farm. And I say us, there's several of us living on the farm, primarily my wife and me, and also we have a MOFGA, Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners, apprentices, interns who live with us from time to time. So they sent a photographer. She was just great. And then I spent hours on the phone with different people from the magazine. I knew nothing about the magazine except all the cliches that you hear. And I'd never looked at a copy. And I'll have to say, they were wonderful. The people were great. They were thorough. When the article came out, there was not a lot of writing, but what they wrote was accurate, respectful. It really was. The one thing I got out of that experience was, if you read an article in Martha Stewart Living, there may not be a lot there, but whatever is there, you can believe it's true. I was very impressed. So anyway, enough of Martha Stewart, though. So I moved. I could speak for 6 hours, and I'm not going to. I'm going to try to speak for about half an hour, and then let you ask questions if you have any questions. I did not grow up in an apple orchard. I grew up in suburbia in Massachusetts and in California, and when I got to Maine, what I wanted to do was sort of do a Thoreau thing. I wanted to abandon, or as they say in Concord now, a thorough thing, because they pronounce it thorough now. And so I wanted to go out in the woods, build a cabin. I was in the 60s, all that stuff, and just disappear, sort of like that guy that went to Alaska and died. Only I didn't want to die, and so I went to all of a sudden around me, everybody else all of a sudden wanted to do it too. And I wanted to do it at age 11. And then when I got to Colby, there was this back to the land thing that I know a lot of you remember. And so all my friends, it was like Madeline when she got sick, and everybody else wants to get sick too. They all wanted to do this thing too. And so next thing I knew, two of my friends and I were purchasing property in Palermo. We didn't know anything about Palermo. We just found the land. It was, and of course back then you called it the land. It was not differentiated from anybody else's the land. It was just everybody lived on the land, and so we lived on the land, and it was very cheap. It was $4,500 for 180 acres, but that was then. And so we moved out there in the summer of 1972, and immediately built little buildings to live in that were, we used logs, and we immediately found older people who were mentors, who became mentors. And for me, until most of them are deceased, my decades have been marked by several, probably now maybe even 15, really wonderful older mentors that I had. And at first they were largely older men. I mean, they've all been pretty much older men who taught me how to build things, but then they taught me how to garden. And our neighbors came down. They were dairy farmers. They wouldn't let us have a garden on our property. We lived in the woods. We had no soil. They said, you got to come up to our place. So they gave us land, plowed the land for us, gave us manure, showed us how to do things. And the big maybe the big thing that happened to me early on was that one of the wonderful things about apples is that, and it's unlike almost any other fruit tree, pears are like this sort of, is that apple trees can grow to be exceedingly old. People that study peaches down south don't have the historical resource that we have up here because peach trees just don't grow very old. So they're having a terrible time reconstructing and reclaiming and finding the old peach varieties. Many of them are just gone. They'll never be back. But apple trees grow to be very old. And so, so there I was 21. I was living on a shoestring in a little cabin, and all around me were these old trees, and they were all fruiting. And no one was, not no one, but almost no one was doing anything with the fruit. So I would travel around town, and of course I wanted to wear, I got my clothes at the secondhand clothes store because that was fashionable back then. And free food was really great. It was free food, and so I would see these trees. I'd stop in, I'd knock on the door, and out would come the grandparents, who were my grandparents' generation, the ones that were born, say, 1880, 1900, that generation. They'd come out because the kids, who were my parents' generation, they had all gone off to work at Bath Iron Works or Augusta or Waterville or someplace, Gardner, Rockland. And so they'd come out, and they were still living there because that was the way the families worked. And I'd say, do you want the apples on their tree? And they'd say, no, go ahead. And next thing I know, I'm out in their yard collecting, or their little farm orchard, because every farm in Maine had an orchard, 10 or 12 trees. And I'm out picking the apples, and then they're out there with me. And so Graham and Gramps are out there, and next thing I know, they're telling me all about the farms and the people who live there and the roads. And of course, the roads had no names because I was the only one in town, just about, who had moved there in maybe 15 years. So there was no road signs on the names. I didn't even know what the names of the roads were. And then they tell me the name of an apple. And then it starts to dawn on me that these apples actually have names, and they have names that I don't know, that I had never heard of. And one of the first ones was the Baldwin. And then there was the Northern Spy, and then there was the Wolf River, and the Tolman Sweet, and the Pound Sweet, and on and on and on. And so at a certain point, I decided that I had to plant one of these things. And I also started to get this image in my head that these trees, these apples, were a gift to me. These had become my trees. Now, I didn't own any of them. I didn't own any of them, but I could go to them, and people got to know me, and they wanted me to come. And I would come in the driveway, and these older people would come out, and they would say, "We were wondering when you would show up this year," and your trees are out there waiting for you. And they would literally talk about them as though they were my trees. And so I started to think about the fact that these were a gift to me from someone who never knew that I would exist, and who had done this thing, which was to plant these trees and to graft them. And I'll say a teeny bit about grafting. And that somehow I wanted to not let that get lost, not let that gift that I had received get lost, and that it was going to be somehow my responsibility to sort of move that process forward, to continue that process. And so at one day I went to a house, and I knocked on the door. I said, I see that you have an apple tree full of apples. Do you want the fruit? I would like to take the fruit. And he said, no, you can't have the fruit. And I was very surprised. And he said, but let's go out and look at the tree. So he came out with me, and this was right in the town where I live, in Palermo. And he said, I grafted that tree. And he was a very old man, and it was a beautiful tree. And I thought, wow, and this was my first experience with grafting. Now, I don't want to talk too much about grafting because there's other things that are more important, but essentially, if you plant an apple from a seed, then you get something new and unique every single time. You can plant 5 million Macintosh seeds, they'll all come up, they'll all make fruit, none will be Macintosh and none will be the same as any of the others. So that's why grafting exists. So when you graft, you take a little snippet, a little teeny piece of, that big, of what you want to graft, you splice it onto a rootstock, it's called, and then you get, from that junction on, you get the variety. So that's why when you go to an orchard of Macintosh, there's a row of Macintosh, a row of Cortland, a row of Honeycrisp, so forth, and those have all been grafted, every one of them. So he had grafted this tree. So he took me into his barn, and he showed me his little box of his knife and his wax and everything, and that day, I learned about this thing called grafting. So I realized then immediately I was going to have to learn to graft. So I found somebody to teach me how. It was not him, it was somebody else. And then I began to graft everything I possibly could, and I think I was grafting cherry apples onto cherries. I was not real good at tree identification yet, but I planted a few apple trees on my property, and I bought them from someplace like Stark Brothers or something, one of the national fruit nurseries. And I grew the apples, and a year or two later, none of them were doing well. A couple of them died. Nothing was doing well. And I remember actually the moment I was driving down we live on a dirt road. I was driving down the dirt road towards our driveway, and I was trying to think, why isn't this working? And then I thought about all these trees, all these varieties, many of which I had no idea what they were. I mean, I was learning them around town, and I was thinking, you know what? I need to be planting those. That's what I need to be planting. I need to be planting these old traditional varieties. They grew well here for 150 years. Why not plant them now? So then I basically took off on this adventure for 35 years of attempting to track down these historic, whatever you want to call it, heirloom, historic, whatever, varieties that are either originated in Maine or were traditionally grown in Maine and maybe originated someplace else. And I began to graft the rarest ones, and over time, over the next maybe 20 years or so, turned our farm into really a repository of rare varieties. And I was able to do that because with grafting, you can put a separate variety on every branch. So you can have an apple tree with 15, 20 varieties on it because you can put, a graft on here, a graft on here, a graft on here, and so forth. And so what I was able to do is I was able to sort of circumvent becoming an orchardist and jump all the way to being a preservationist. I didn't want to have one tree of each apple because then I would become an orchardist and I'd spend all my time trying to take care of these trees, and what I really wanted to do was I wanted to save these varieties because they were just going fast. Meanwhile, the only people around that really knew much about apples were the commercial orchardists. And so I would go to various events at the Maine Pomological Society, and out of state I went to different things where there was commercial orchardists. And they just totally, I guess the word we used to use was dissed the heirlooms. They just despised them. And to them, they were all spitters. They were worth nothing. They should not be grown. It was good that we don't grow them anymore. They were worth nothing. Let's get rid of them all. And so I would mostly like shut up and not say anything because I didn't want to get into arguments about it. But something did not make sense to me. I couldn't understand why these people who were brilliant, everybody in Maine lived on some version of a farm. These were the smartest people because they were these people who came here and they found, where are the farms in Maine? They're all on the best farmland. They knew where the best land was. They made these beautiful farms. They bred horses, they bred vegetables, they bred fruit. Why would they breed apples that were no good? I couldn't figure it out. So then I decided that what I should do is I should learn to make an apple pie. And the reason why was because I started to get a hunch that these apples were not meant to be eaten for dessert. A dessert apple is an apple that you eat like this, fresh, for dessert. Now, you don't make it into a dessert, you eat it for dessert. You eat it, as they say in England, with a knife. And a Honeycrisp, Macintosh is sort of a cooking apple of sorts, but Honeycrisp would be a good example. Gala would be a good example. Fuji would be a good example. They are apples that are dessert apples. They're not designed to be cooked with. So a friend of mine was a pretty good chef, and he taught me how to make an apple pie. And I didn't want to make an apple pie that was, and this is going to sound funny, a really, really good apple pie. What I wanted to do was I wanted to make an apple pie that the crust would not distract from the fruit, but it would be good enough so that people wouldn't, they'd want to eat it. So I learned how to make a fairly decent, simple crust, and then I started making single variety apple pies with every apple I could find, of these old ones. And some I knew the names of now. As I said, Baldwin, Northern Spy, Wolf River, Pound Sweet, Pumpkin Sweet, on and on and on. And some were of ones that I didn't know the names of, but I was beginning to figure out how to learn the names. Partly I used lots of different ways. I won't go into that right now, but many different methods. It's like being Sherlock Holmes. And lo and behold, I started to figure out, you know what? This apple makes a better pie than anything you can buy in a store. And then I started to realize that my hunch was correct, that these apple varieties that had been so carefully bred, well selected, grafted, handed down, named, passed around. They were passed around from community to community like folk songs. Many of them had multiple names. They'd go from one town to another. They'd just name them after whoever had them in that town. That's because it was not a commercial industry. It was a home industry. These people were essentially subsistence farmers of some sort or another. And so then I started to, and a good comment that I like to remember is that one year we were, and so I've now made pies with dozens and dozens of varieties, all single varieties. I mean, occasionally I'll make them with a mix, and they probably are better as a mix, but I wanted to do it single variety so I could really see what can that apple do in a pie. And not to belabor, but I do go to, my wife and I go to a gathering of friends every fall at an old camp in Belgrade. And there's about 50 people there, all friends. and I got this idea one year when I was really getting into this thing of making single variety pies. I took, and now I've been doing this now for many, many years, but that first year, and what I do now is I would take several varieties with me of different apples that are ripe right then, and then make 3 or 4 pies, one of each single variety, and then we cut them up, and everybody gets a paper plate, and we take a magic marker and make 3 divisions like a Mercedes-Benz thing, and then put a teeny piece of each one in each space, and then number them, and everybody eats, and then everybody votes. And these are people that are not farmers. These are like our friends from, back where I grew up in suburbia, and they're dentists and doctors and college professors and whatever. And we do this thing, this pie contest. We call it the pie taste-off. And people get passionate. They get rabid about it. Because if you eat a single variety with a decent apple, a decent pie apple, if you eat one slice from one pie, it tastes like an apple pie. And it doesn't taste really all that different from any other pie. But then you eat 3 slices at the same time, or 4 slices from different pies, and I'm talking just a little sliver, and you cannot believe the difference that you notice. And so we vote, and people yell and scream and so forth and so on, and get their favorites. But then I decided that I should take this a step further, and so I started making applesauce with every variety I could find. Some apples will cook into the most exquisite applesauce in about 3 minutes, literally. And so in the summer, I'll go out and I'll pick the apples right off the ground as they drop, because you want them to be perfectly ripe. And an apple like, say, Cole's quince, that's an apple, not a quince, that originated in southern Maine. Bring it inside, cut it up, put it in a saucepan. I'm not talking about a vat of applesauce. It's just like 3 or 4 apples. You can make it in the morning, or have it with your meat if you like meat, or have it with your oatmeal or whatever. And you cook it up, and 3-4 minutes later, you have this beautiful applesauce. Another apple, you cut it all up, stick it in the pot. An hour later, it's like limp leather floating around in the water. They all have their different qualities. And one other thing I was going to say about the pies was, one day we were having one of these sort of taste-offs at our farm, and one of our apprentices said, "That was the worst tasting apple I ever ate," because we all tasted the apple first. And she said, "That was the best tasting pie I ever ate." So you cannot tell. People say, well, I'll use McIntosh for a pie. McIntosh makes very good applesauce, but it also makes applesauce in a pie. So you end up with this soup in your pie. Now, what this led me to decide, believe, whatever, is that the reason why all these commercial growers were hating or whatever, dissing the old heirlooms, is because they didn't know we've lost. Why were these grown? Well, they weren't grown to be put in a lunchbox. For one thing, most of these people didn't use lunchboxes. They came home and ate their dinner, as they called it, in the middle of the day, at home. And so these were used for apple butter, apple pie, apple sauce, apple cake, molasses. They made molasses out of them. They made cider, of course, and so forth and so on. If you really search the old cookbooks, you'll find dozens of recipes for using apples that we can't even figure out what they mean. We haven't even heard of these anymore, of the way they were being used. So anyway, we have many uses. Plus, we have many seasons, of course. It's an amazing fruit. You can harvest the first. We'll harvest our first variety, which is called Crimson Beauty, which is one that came from New Brunswick long, long ago. We'll harvest that on July 30th. And we'll harvest our last apples at the last second that we dare in sort of late October, early November. And then those will go into the root cellar, and we'll be eating those until June. And so for Mainers and for other people that were living in, really all over the eastern U.S., the apple was the perfect fruit because you could plant it on not your best land. Traditionally they would keep their best land for their row crops, and then the next best land would be their pasture, and the next best land would be their orchards because it can be rocky. You can plant them where you can't move the boulders or whatever, and in an economy where there's very little commerce and the roads were terrible, you need a fruit that you can grow on your farm, and the apple is for, at least for much of the U.S., the apple is the perfect fruit for that. Now, so at a certain point, my little repository at my farm, at our farm, we just ran out of space, and so I started thinking, well, should I buy some more land? What should I do here? And Russell Livy, who some of you know of or maybe even know, who was the much beloved, and now he died of cancer a couple of years ago, director at MOFGA, he and I were very close friends, and we spent a lot of time exploring the countryside for these old trees. I'm going to quickly say something about the old trees themselves, because I said how old they live. They can live to be 200 years old. One of the beauties of this work that I'm doing, and Todd was saying about how there used to be X number, we think, of varieties in Maine. Many of them, they are still here. And they're waiting patiently behind a gas station or an abandoned field or whatever. One of the beauties of what happened when Maine transitioned out of the agricultural, economy that it had is that unlike Massachusetts, which basically got sort of paved over, I mean, I'm being a little simplistic here, but with Maine, it basically just got abandoned. And so a lot of the farmland is still here and is ready to go if we can just figure out how to access that land to young people who want to farm, of which there are many. But also, a lot of the trees did not get cut down. So we'll say, maybe there was 3,000 varieties growing here in Maine. My guess is, if I had to say, I bet that 2,000 of them still are here. It's just a matter of tracking them down and somehow figuring out, identifying them, which is very difficult to do, and then grafting them and saving them by grafting. And so, with Russell Livy's assistance, and I'm also on the MOFGA board of directors, and through the board of directors and so forth, we decided that we would resurrect a gravel pit that was purchased by MOFGA, and with some other land. They just wound up with a gravel pit, and we decided that we would terrace the gravel pit, think sort of a combination of Vietnam and Peru, and we'd terrace it, and then we would plant it with these rare heritage, whatever you want to call it, historic apples. And then we would also do it in a new, we would grow the trees, we would cultivate the trees in a progressive way. There are what we call certified organic growers in the United States of apples, but pretty much if you went to their orchard, it would look just like every other orchard. It's just that the poisons that they spray on them are less toxic or, whatever. What we wanted to do is grow them in an entirely different way that would look very different and might even negate the necessity for any spraying at all. And so that method, and that's another whole discussion, but just to whet your appetite, basically that means interplanting with hundreds of other species of plants plants that are so aromatic, think garlic or onions or tansy or chives, or that make the environment, that fill the environment with aromatics so that the pests come in and don't actually know they're in an apple orchard. That's sort of a little bit of the idea. Also, that certain plants you can plant in the orchard and they will bring up minerals from deep within the soil that will then be accessed by the apples. Or they will act as a habitat for the pollinators. Because you can't, these days what we do in our big, large-scale agriculture is we truck in the bees in a big truck, and then we put them out in the orchard or the blueberry barrens or whatever, and then we truck them off to the next place. Well, if you use native pollinators, you can't just have apples that bloom. You have to have something for them to eat before the apples show up, before the apples blossom, and afterwards. So you create this habitat that will be a mixed, what we call a polyculture rather than a monoculture. So that's part of what we're doing too. So plus I wanted this to be a shared vision. I like to say that I can let my own ego run wild in my yard and do whatever I want as long as my wife agrees. But at MOFGA, I wanted to, and any of you who are involved here know all about what I'm talking about. There's something really wonderful about creating a shared vision, which is what COA is, with other people. That it doesn't become your vision, it becomes a shared vision. And so this orchard at MOFGA has become a shared vision, shall we say, with lots of different ideas of how to do this, how to renovate distressed, disturbed, abandoned land, how to grow apples or grow fruit in a different kind of way, and how to preserve this incredible genetic heritage that we have, and that to go back to the start there was this incredible gift that came to us and that we now get to steward and pass on. And I'm going to quit and let you ask some questions, but I want to say one other thing first, which is that people will say to me, well why do this? And it is partly the history, it's partly the wonderful agricultural history that we all share, being Mainers, whether we've lived here for a month or all our lives. It's also partly the stories behind who were these people, who were the people that named the Marlboro apple, for example, that Todd mentioned, that I was able to track down. It's also that these are, they have so many uses, that we don't just need another crisp, juicy, sweet dessert apple. We need apples that are good for many uses, especially as people get more interested in producing their own food and cooking and so forth. Also, many of these apples were remarkably insect and disease resistant. Our ancestors did not have sprays and so forth. The worst disease that apples get in Maine is something called scab, and the two most susceptible varieties are Cortland and McIntosh. And those are the two varieties, until Honeycrisp came along, that were the most planted varieties in Maine. In our orchard, which is now, we'll say, I've lost track, but it's probably 200 varieties or so. We have never in 30 years ever once sprayed for scab. And we don't get scab. That's because when a variety is very scabby in our orchard, out it goes. We don't grow it. And McIntosh is a very old variety. It originated about 1800. But commercial growers refused to grow it until the advent of modern fungicides in the early 1900s. And I've talked to old timers, and they've said, McIntosh, no, we would not grow it. It was because it was too disease prone. As we create I like to say, as we create an agriculture for the 21st century, there's going to be a lot of elements. Land access is going to be a biggie, as I said. But I think that, that what we have been given, this heritage of these apples, that we may want to grow some of these varieties. We may not want to grow them. But what these people gave us by their example, by the varieties, by just everything that they did, is something that we can learn a huge amount from, and that we may actually want to even be growing many of these. Many of these they're excellent varieties, including for dessert. Some of them are the best tasting, even fresh, better than Honeycrisp. So, but I don't want to end my talk saying better than Honeycrisp. I'll say, what an incredible gift from anonymous people that will never know us. And it's up to us in our own way, now I'll be preachy, not forget about apples for a minute, for each of us to give some gift anonymously to whoever it is that comes next. So, thank you. So I'll try to answer some questions. Sure, hi.
Thanks, Jeff. I was stunned by your statement that if you threw up Macintosh seeds, I think you used as an example.
Yeah.
And you got all these different varieties. I'm not sure I know how to ask the question, but genetically, what's the explanation for that? I mean,
Yeah. Well, the sort of the lay version is that apples are not self-pollinating, so that you can't have, the reason why you go to a commercial orchard and there's a row of Max and a row of Cortland and a row of Macau and a row of Empire, whatever, is largely, I mean, it's partly because they want a bunch of varieties in the orchard for, the customers, but it is largely for pollination, that you must have two different varieties. 1,000 Macintosh trees is just like having one variety on a lot of different stems. So you got to have so every apple seed is a genetic combination between the apple variety from which the pollen came and the apple variety on which the flower resides. So the apple, if going to our orchard here, our Macintosh apple tree, all those apples on that tree will always be Macintosh. Occasionally they do weird genetic mutations, but very rarely. So basically you can say that a Macintosh apple will always have Macintosh apples on it, but the seeds will be unique, every seed. And just a teeny adjunct to that is that originally when Europeans settled Maine, settled Hancock County, they planted all their apples from seed. So everybody had this incredible genetic diversity growing in their orchard, in their small orchards, all over the eastern U.S. So there were millions of essentially amateur plant breeders planting apples from seed, seeing what they got, and then naming them. And that's why by roughly the time of the Civil War, there were somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 30,000 named American varieties just growing east of the Mississippi. So that's basically, yeah.
So have you found wonderful varieties here on Mount Desert Island?
Yes.
And number two, as a consumer, where can you buy these apples in the fall?
Well, I don't know what the commercial orchard situation is in Hancock County. Todd might know a little better than I do. But what I tell people is, when you go to the grocery store, when you go to the farmer's market, when you go to the farm stand, wherever you go, when you go to an orchard, ask them, say, I want a pie apple, or I want an heirloom, or whatever. My my commercial orcharding friends now are starting to plant heirlooms. One of my friends recently, a few years ago, he said to me he would never plant. There's this apple called Black Oxford, which is this amazing Maine apple originated in Oxford County. And I can remember him saying, "Oh, I'll never plant Black Oxford, blah 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 blah." And then a couple of years later, he came to me and said, "We want to plant Black Oxfords. Can you get me the trees?" So it is changing, but it's sometimes senators say, I got 4 letters asking me to do something or other, and that changed their mind. If it's up to us to change the food system, whether it's apples or whatever it is, by simply asking, that will help.
Just a quick answer to the question. There are no commercial producers of heirloom apples in the area. Beach Hill Farm, we have some. We have about 12 varieties that we've been slowly restoring, which are 3 orchard blocks up there. So in the fall, they have some. They have Pewaukee, St. Lawrence, Baldwin, Famuse, King of Tompkins County. So we have some of the classics up there, but in small amounts. The other thing is down in Brooklyn, there's a nursery called 5 Star Nursery and Orchard by Tim Seabrook and Leslie Cummings, and they bring them. Shartner's brings them to the Bar Harbor farmers market here. And John and Cammie have organized a CSA, which is you can buy heirloom apples. You buy a share and then they deliver them, and we're working to have them delivered here again this year. We do that through Beach Hill Farm as well. But you can ask me more.
And
about
actually, we have some. I forgot. I brought some flyers for this. It's like a subscription. You pay at the beginning of the season, and then you get these rare apples every 2 weeks. And we probably will deliver to Bar Harbor. So if you're interested,
you get 5 different varieties every other week, and they're really great.
But the most important thing is to just ask people, because that's going to be what gets people to bring them in.
COA will eventually be producing enough to sell, we hope.
Sure.
First, a comment. If you want to pass on the favor that people did for John and others, you can buy these varieties from Fedco trees. They have Black Oxford and lots of others. You just have to 10 years on your hands.
Yeah.
So my question is about rootstock. John, a couple of times you mentioned planting trees first on your own land and then in the repository at MOFGA. And so my question is, like, when you plant, are you digging up a tree, or are you putting grafting onto rootstock? And if you could talk a little about the roots, the bottom part of the tree.
Sure. If you everybody here has heard of a dwarf and a semi-dwarf tree, and some of you have heard of a standard tree. A dwarf Macintosh, a semi-dwarf Macintosh, and a standard Macintosh are all the exact same Macintosh. They were just grafted onto a different rootstock. The rootstock in every case is always an apple, but, a standard fruit tree is grown on a rootstock grown from a seed. So what growers will do is they will select apple seed that the tree comes relatively true to type. So the tree will produce a robust, hardy, healthy tree pretty reliably from seed. We grow the seed. The tree gets to be about this tall. It might be about the diameter of your thumb. Then it is cut off very close to the ground, and that can be done in the ground while the rootstock is growing in the ground, or it can be done in your workshop. You can dig them up and do it when the trees are dormant. They call it bench grafting right inside. But anyways, it's the same process. Then you graft this little piece of the variety that you want to save, the scion it's called, S-C-I-O-N, like the car, and you graft it onto, you splice it. The graft is a fairly simple but elegant splice, and they slip together, and then you put a little piece of tape around it. And then you plant it out in your nursery. And this is what we did we've planted now at the orchard at Unity at MOFGA. We planted the first 100 varieties we planted this spring. those 100 varieties, I went out and I collected the scion wood from the old trees, some from the trees at our farm, but many from the original trees. I went out and collected the scion wood, we grafted it. We grafted 3 or 4 of each variety, so we could hedge our bet. And then we grew them in a nursery, and we planted them about that far apart, like a row of beans. And we planted them, and then 2 years later, they grow. They start out literally, just that tall. And then over the course of 2 years, they'll grow to be about, we'll say, 4 or 5 feet tall. And then we dig them up, and we dig them up in November. We store them we actually store them in sort of healed in, you might say, in sawdust for the winter, inside, in a cold space, in a space that's about 35 degrees. And then in the spring, you go out and you plant them. And so that's how we have done the process. And so we have, at our farm, that's where our nursery is, we have right now several hundred more varieties that are at various stages of growth that we will then add to that orchard over time. And we're going to keep on grafting them until, really probably almost indefinitely. But we think that the orchard will be only doing a few each year once we get to about 500 or 600 varieties. How about another question maybe, or we need to stop?
And let me just make one comment about that. If you're interested in grafting, we do a grafting workshop with MOFGA every spring here at the college. We do pruning, tree pruning, renovating old trees, and a grafting workshop. And so we do those over in the Zoe Lab, and we grafted 130 trees 3 years ago. They were up at Beach Hill Farm, and 60 this year that students did. So we have about 200 that eventually we're going to plant out at Peggy Rockefeller, and back we're going to do a new orchard block up it. But it's dead simple in the sense that once you learn that technique, it's pretty easy, and it's a lot of fun because once you plant it, it's very gratifying. When it comes up, within about 3 weeks whether you did it right or wrong.
So one other quick comment, and I'll answer your question. You could be the last question. If you are interested in being in touch with me, if you have a question that I wasn't able to answer today, you can be in touch with COA, with Todd, whatever, and they'll put you in touch with me. Also, if you're interested in participating in what we're doing over at Unity, we'd love to have you participate in any way. We'd love your support in any way. And I'm also always looking for very old trees. And if you want to know what an old tree is, I like to say, pretend that you brought somebody from Africa who'd never seen an old apple tree before, and you brought them here on a visit, and then you took them to an apple tree, and they looked at it and they went, "Wow, that's old." So, in other words, someone who's never seen an apple tree, they know it's old. I like them like this, hollow, broken down, bent over. Those are the ones that we're looking for.
You mentioned that to avoid the use of pesticides, you plant different things in your orchard, such as garlic and all these different items. I take it that would work too in a vegetable and flower garden?
Oh yeah.
To keep away.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So, but it's a big subject, but one definitely worth experimenting with and having fun with and exploring. So anyway, I'll just say thank you very much. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you all for coming. When I opened up the discussion last week, I said I'm going to allow myself one plug for the college. And Todd, I'd like you to just sit and hear this one out. Could you explain what we're doing with the Island Institute on food, and especially on the Outer Islands? I think it's obviously relevant to our discussion today. Yeah.
So just very quickly, one of the things that John mentioned about apples in Maine is that the diversity of apples here is actually extraordinarily high because the orchards were abandoned just before commercial agriculture simplified to 6 common varieties in the 1920s. So we have very, very high apple diversity here in Maine. in these relict orchards. And I've been very interested in the islands for a number of years with the idea that perhaps old French and possibly Basque apples still exist in these genetically isolated places out on the outer islands. So the college several years ago, 2 years ago, started to discuss a collaboration with the Island Institute. And I have been very interested in local agriculture, and so I propose that we look at the history of island agriculture, particularly the orcharding, but trying to understand the food system of the islands, how people fed themselves, but also what of these very old trees might still exist. And one of the things that's really exciting to me is we can then, once we collect them, we can actually compare them genetically to French and Spanish collections and see if we have some very... So I'm working with the Island Institute. A fellow has been placed on Great Cranberry Island. He's going to work with Little Cranberry and Great Cranberry students from both schools to basically document every tree on both islands, and maybe do we'll see, maybe do like a little book of the apples of Cranberry Island, and then we're going to do something similar, hopefully up and down the coast, to see if we can find some really old, unusual apples. Because they provide, one of the things, I had a student do a project on North Haven, and this is the typical COA human ecology. I sat down with her and said, okay, how far can a bee fly? I want to know which islands are genetically isolated, right? And we were trying to figure out if a bee could come down the Fox Island thoroughfare, island to island, and make it to North Haven, or whether those were genetic. And so that's the kind of thing that is really fun about this, because we're beginning to stitch together some of that so we can look at the local food history and crossing our fingers to find some really, really old apple trees. So.
Yeah, it's a great way to get our own students out doing work, working with their hands and working collaboratively, not only with faculty members, but also with island community members. And so that's what the larger partnership is all about. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. Go enjoy the day.